I'm delighted to introduce your interviewer for this evening, Simon Ward. Simon is a former film programmer at London's ICA, BFI London Film Festival, and Tate Modern, among others. He is currently a trustee of the Independent Cinema Office and, along with his wife, owns the Palace Cinema in Broadstairs. This is the third instalment of Simon's In Conversation series with our guest tonight, who we're also delighted to be welcoming back, the film programmer, curator, critic and filmmaker, Tony Rayns. So I'm going to hand over to you both now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Gemma. So yes, Tony, this is our third conversation.
Part 3.
And
who'd have thought it?
Who'd have thought it indeed, but I think the last time we were here, we just finished covering your time at the Vancouver Film Festival.
Yes.
Which I think ended in about 2016, didn't it?
Sounds right.
We'd also talked about your time programming with the London Film Festival, with Edinburgh. And I thought we'd sort of pick up briefly just to say, I think it's worth noting that you've also had your hand in many other film festivals around the world.
I don't know about many. I've been to many. Most of the festivals I've been involved with, I've been there as a jury member, as somebody serving on a festival jury. There've been a few that I've worked with as a programmer, but on a one-off basis mostly. So for many years, under a regime that's now gone, I did work for Rotterdam Film Festival in Holland, which was I always thought was, of all the festivals in Europe, the one that stayed closest to its founding principles of supporting independent cinema, in fact, and alternative, sometimes radical, sometimes not radical, but anyway, not mainstream. But now there's been a new regime in place in Rotterdam. Everything has changed. The programmers have changed. It remains to be seen whether the policies will change. But anyway, I'm no longer associated with them, or they haven't approached me, the new people. If they did, I don't think I'd be very receptive. So those days are gone. But for about 5 or 6 years, I did events for them, yes.
I fondly remember your Nagasaki retrospective.
I did one of those, that's for sure, yes. I've tended to do East Asian things for them.
Yeah.
There was a year when Simon Field was the director that he wanted to focus particularly on Japan, and I suggested 3 strands for him to do. Well, one in animation, one in mainstream genre filmmaking, and one in experimental filmmaking. And so we had 3 strands in parallel, covering 3 different bases of Japanese cinema.
Maybe it's time to think about Simon Field and your long relationship with him. And indeed, before he was at Rotterdam, his time spent at the ICA in London, where indeed I got to know you as well some years later. But I think, is it fair to say that your work with Simon, where you introduced for the first time in the West some of the major names of East Asian cinema, everyone from Takeshi Kitano to Wong Kar-wai to... Do you want to talk about that period? For example,
okay, briefly. I knew Simon before that, actually, before the ICA, because we were at different universities, but around the same time, almost exactly the same period of modern history, I guess. And we met, I think, because we shared an interest in experimental cinema. And had an interest initially in the American avant-garde, which was being promoted heavily internationally by a man called P. Adams Sitney, who was touring a package of key films.
What's that famous book? His book?
It's called Experimental Cinema, right, I think.
Right.
So it's a big fat.
I remember that.
Very
key text.
It was a very academic book, and I don't think he's a very exciting writer. But in any event, yes, it was a key document in getting the movement known and taken seriously. And Simon and I were both very much interested already in that area, even before Sitney's book came out. And that was what brought us together in the first instance. Then Simon edited a magazine, or co-edited a magazine called After Image, and invited me to contribute some writing to it, which I did. In fact, recently something called the After Image Reader has just been published by Mark Webber, and his little imprint, and a fine volume. And I'm pleased to say that one of my pieces is in there, a piece about Jeff Keane, the late Brighton filmmaker. So we had this connection, a fairly loose connection in those days. but this is in the 1970s, I guess. Then he became director of the ICA Cinema. And he, I think already by this time in the 80s, through Archie Tate, I had helped the ICA with Chinese cinema. I had introduced a film called Yellow Earth, which was considered the flagship film for the so-called fifth generation in China. I'd shown it in Edinburgh because I was still working with Edinburgh, Jim Hickey's Edinburgh at that time. And I remember very well Archie Tate, then working at the ICA, coming up to me at the end of the screening in Edinburgh and saying, "That's wonderful, we must show it." And thinking, at last, all these efforts to try and get somebody interested in this modern Chinese cinema were going to pay off. It was going to happen. And sure enough, true to his word, the ICA did buy it, and they subsequently picked up other fifth generation titles, including Horse Thief and Black Cannon Incident and Swan Song. And
had these been released anywhere else outside of China?
At that time, I think they were beginning to trickle into distribution.
America,
Horse Thief. America was, as usual, slower, but eventually I think things found their way into some kind of distribution. But it's a very marginal thing in America. Of course, it's marginal in Britain too. I'm not.
Yellow Earth disappeared for
the
a
mainstream, but people started to take these things seriously in around the mid '80s. And Britain was certainly up there at the front. I mean, or near the front. It was one of the first countries to give these things proper commercial runs and do well with them. I mean, to find an audience for them. So, and then Simon Field came in and inherited that situation and we became quite close collaborators. I mean, if I was traveling on behalf of various film festivals looking for films to program, I was spending a lot of time each year traveling mostly in East Asia, looking for new films that I thought showed promise or interest, and coming back and looking for ways and places to show them. And the ICA became high on that list suddenly because Simon made it clear that he was interested in potentially discovering filmmakers and giving them commercial runs. I mean, acquiring the films for ICA projects, which was the distribution arm, and giving them more exposure. So I would come back and say, listen, I've seen this extraordinary film here. I think you might look at that and see if you want to do something with it. It happened most famously with Akira, which is the anime film, the huge scale anime film by Otomo Katsuhiro, who was, of course, a very famous manga artist, but had himself moved into anime.
A smash hit in Japan, but
it had been an enormous hit in Japan, but it was owned largely by the book publishing company Kodansha, who had published the original work, the manga. And Kodansha was a major partner in the film production as well, the production of the film version. And Kodansha had little or no experience in international film distribution and foreign sales and things like that, and was cynical, skeptical, in the way the Japanese are. Japanese companies are slow, nervous, scared, terrified of being misunderstood or ripped off, and hard to do business with on the whole.
I have this experience too.
It's a common experience.
Yeah.
It's, people in many countries have discovered this.
Yeah.
So I helped to mediate a little bit. I'd met Otomo. I did an interview with him for the London magazine Time Out to help promote the release of Akira in London. And to everybody's great relief, including Kodansha's, it must be said, the thing was a smash hit. It moved from the ICA to the Odeon Leicester Square. I think it was something the ICA was not big enough to contain.
And you told me once
that
Akira, for example, they were sort of imagining that someone like Warner Brothers would come in with a big offer.
I'm sure they were.
And release this film, so they were a bit sort of surprised.
Anime was a totally a niche thing at this time. And the majors were completely unaware of the impact of published translations. There was an American comics publisher had been publishing in supposedly monthly installments, although sometimes a lot longer.
That's a lot of months.
A lot of months went by between an issue. They published a translation of the original Akira, which was still being written at the time. It wasn't even a finished project in Japan. And I was well aware from patronizing comics shops that this was an obsession for a large number of people in the Western world.
I was actually buying those myself.
I'm sure you were, yes,
Yeah.
yes, and so was I. And so I was well aware that there would be a lot of people out there very, very interested to see Akira. This was not evident to Water Street or any of the major companies. And so when I went to Simon and he in turn went to Kodansha to inquire about it, they were baffled that some, in their view, tin pot outfit like the ICA would be interested in their big film, which was so expensive and going to be such an enormous global phenomenon. Well, it did turn out to be something of a global phenomenon, but not thanks to them, I think. I think that it was what happened in Britain that really sparked that, because the ICA, a rather small outfit for distribution and exhibition, bought the film, opened it, and the floodgates opened. I mean, there was suddenly a huge amount of interest from a lot of people, and the screens had to dramatically expand to make enough space for the audience that wanted to see this film.
And then lots of other companies started to look for
They
similar
did.
films.
Yeah.
And so
It never happened quite like
Yeah.
that again, but I also, there's a remarkable film called Summer Vacation 1999, which is an early feature, not the first, I think, but second or third, by a director called Kaneko Shusuke. He was a very nice guy. Later became known for monster films, for Kaiju Eiga, the remakes of Mothra and things like that. And he had made a film. This is based on a very Japanese genre called shoujo manga, which are manga aimed at a young female audience. And they have a specialist interest in gay male love stories. And this is one. The original comic, written by a woman, behind Summer Vacation 1999, is a story about summer in a boys' boarding school, where some pupils have not been able to go home for some reason, so they're left there alone, looking after themselves, left to their own devices, and then a new pupil turns up unexpectedly and is a dead ringer for somebody who died in the last term. And confusion and ghost hauntings and all kinds of speculations occur, together with some stirrings of the heart. This film was notable for many reasons. There was nothing quite like it seen in the West at the time, but the most notable thing of all is that all four boys were played by girls, looking very masculine, but nonetheless unmistakably girls. And this was, I thought, of interest enough, and just as a phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon, that I drew it to Simon's attention, and Simon said, "Yeah, this is amazing." So that opened. It didn't have the same kind of success as Akira, but it was nonetheless, one of the titles that we brought to the UK, which the ICA got behind because of Simon's willingness to take a risk on them.
And then came films like Chungking Express,
Yeah.
Kitano's films.
Yeah.
I remember traveling up as a student
Yes.
to see Sonatina there.
Yes.
And it really felt like it was a kind of a gateway to new East Asian
Yes.
cinema
Yes.
through your good self.
Well,
And I think,
as I said, these are all things that I discovered on my travels. I've been present at the premieres of most of these things. I mean, I was literally at the first ever screening of Chungking Express, which started something like an hour late because the projection of the cinema manager refused to start the screening until all the reels had arrived from the lab, and the last two reels were still missing. So he waited until everything had come before he agreed to start.
I think as a projectionist, that's probably a good move.
Really,
Really.
the audience was quite rested, but they were quite happy by the end. It was fine, but
Better than leaving them without the last two reels.
The long wait was sort of vindicated finally, but it was still a very fraught evening.
Yeah. And how did you end up at this screening? What was the process?
I'd become friendly with Wong Kar-wai by that time, and it was the beginning of my relationship with Wong Kar-wai. I ended up re-subtitling Chungking Express for him at some stage, and he then asked me to do subtitles for subsequent films up to 2046.
Okay. Yeah.
So for a period of about 7 or 8 years, I was quite close to Wong Kar-wai.
Yes.
We subsequently fell out and have had nothing to do with each other since 2007.
Okay.
So he crossed me off his Christmas card list. I certainly crossed him off my Christmas card list, and it was the end. But anyway, he has now retreated to Shanghai. He now produces China television series. I think his international ambitions are all pretty much over and finished. And I think those people who've seen his later films, including The Grand Master, have also probably tempered their old enthusiasm for his work, I would say.
I think so.
It ain't the same no more.
And Kitano is another interesting figure. And
Same case, actually.
yeah, exactly.
Mr. Kitano.
Was a major figure.
He was for quite a while a major
decade.
figure. He ran out of steam to some degree. I mean, he started making self-reflexive films about himself and his torn identity. One half of him was Kitano Takeshi, the other half of him was Beats Takeshi, the stand-up comedian, part of a double act. And he started to make films dramatizing the dual identity that he was embodying in his person. And they were, let's say, less well received internationally than his gangster films had been. So he found it hard to sustain that. A few years ago, Mr. Kitano had some kind of late middle-aged crisis. I don't know if it's a male menopause or what, but anyway, he suddenly announced to his longtime business manager that he was closing his office. He was leaving his office.
Office Kitano, which is without Kitano.
Indeed.
What kind of office is that?
It was an office that had been doing all kinds of interesting things, publishing various things with his name on them, producing or supervising at least his TV work, which was extensive, producing his feature films, producing a few other feature films in Japan, usually by people who'd worked with him before or were part of the talent stable that they managed as well. They had 30 comedians on the books, most of whom appeared in Kitano's TV shows, and just occasionally foreign films. So thanks to a man called Ichiyama Shozo, who was part of the staff there, having been previously in Shochiku and had been involved in the early Kitano features at Shochiku, moved to Office Kitano and became their sort of in-house producer, and one of the people who spearheaded an expansion into international films. So, for example, from Platform onwards, they were routinely the co-producers of Jia Zhangke's films in China.
Right.
They were also regularly co-producing Abul Fazl Jalili's films in Iran. They produced or co-produced a number of films that Jia Zhangke initiated but didn't make himself. Jia Zhangke cultivated protégés in China, including the young woman Song Fang, who had been a film student in Paris, had done an acting role in Ho Xiaoxian's Flight of the Red Balloon while she was there in Paris, and had then come back to China and started to make features. And Jia Zhangke said, "I'll produce them," because they were completely non-commercial, and he was in position to do. It needed to be done. So those films were also technically Office Kitano co-productions, and so they, sadly, a few years ago, Mr. Kitano walked out of the company. The company couldn't obviously exist without him. It was his presence was the glue that held it all together. So the company closed down. The various projects that supported were either cancelled or reassigned, and a lot of people lost their jobs. Mr. Kitano had left his wife and daughter. Actually, his daughter had already left, I think. She'd had a brief stab at being a pop star, but they'd gone off to do something else, I think computer programming. Mr. Kitano, I don't think had ever been rigorously faithful to his wife, actually, to be brutally honest. But in any event, he ran off with a barmaid, a mama-san from a bar he used to drink in regularly. She had apparently persuaded him that it was crazy to waste all his money on all these outside projects like these weird Chinese films and this kind of stuff. He should be keeping it all himself, and why was he paying money to an agent and so on when he could be paying it to her? And so this precipitated a brainstorm, and he decided to quit Office Kitano. he is now with her. We are, I mean, apparently he will only entertain any proposition for hard cash at this point.
Right.
He's lost any pretensions he had to being interested in film culture or serious filmmaking, and he's been basically rejected and reviled by all his former associates. So I don't think, I mean, he hasn't made a film since this happened, and it seems unlikely that he will now.
Let's, I mean, you touched on Jia Zhangke there, and I know you've got a long-standing relationship with him, and I know that at the ITA, when I was there with David Sin and Ed Fletcher, first thing we were releasing, I think, was one of the first films was Jia Wu.
Yes.
And I'm sure you probably took that film and showed it to us.
I'm sure I did, yes.
I remember. Do you want to talk to us about how, I mean, I know now that, you know, he runs his own film festival. Does he?
Not anymore, but yes.
Pandemic
yes,
wise. But, you know, you've had a long relationship with this man. And
yes.
Perhaps you could talk to us about that.
I've known Jia Zhangke for about 26 years, thereabouts. I met him at the international premiere of Wu, which was in Berlin at the Berlin Festival Forum event, and he was there with his cinematographer Yulik Wai, and we hung out. I took them to the best Chinese restaurant in Berlin. We became friends very quickly and remained friends to this day. I mean, it's a long and very happy relationship, I think. And Jia now, since Platform, Jia has routinely asked me to subtitle his films for him. So I've made frequent visits to his office in Beijing and sat there hammering out subtitle lists. Occasionally I've done things in London by remote, you know, we're asking some questions, clarify this, clarify that. I've shown the films in festivals, I've helped him with press kits. I mean, I've done many things like this. I've also subtitled most of the films that he produced. So that's been a very rewarding and happy experience for me, yes, sure.
And then I was thinking about Korean cinema. So also at the ICA, you with Simon Field, I don't know if anyone can see this, but you produced this Soul Stirring.
I did. That was in '94, I think.
Yeah. And was that sort of the beginning of your when did you start getting involved in Korean cinema? A little earlier than that?
Well,
what was it that drew you?
Okay, I'd been traveling in East Asia since '77.
Right.
Initially to Hong Kong, and then China, and then Taiwan, and then Thailand, and then Japan already by that time, and Philippines.
But South Korea at that point is
I hadn't gone to South Korea. I'd seen a few Korean films in festivals, mostly in Berlin was pretty much the only festival in Europe that routinely showed Korean films. And I'd seen films there because I was a regular visitor to Berlin in those days. This is in the 1980s. Yes, I think it began probably around 1980, after I'd first been to Hong Kong. And I hadn't seen more than a couple of Korean films ever at that point. And then I had met Im Kwon-taek in Berlin, who turned out to be, who knew, you know, the great father of Korean cinema.
Yeah, one of the most prolific directors
yes.
of the time. Yeah.
Yes, although becoming less prolific as he became more ambitious. So he was no longer making genre quickies, but was making more considered and more ambitious and more achieved films, it must be said. And I liked him, but he didn't speak any English, and I didn't speak any Korean at all at that time. And it was therefore hard to communicate except through a translator, and we didn't form any kind of bond. So I didn't feel any great incentive to go to Korea to meet up with Mr. Im. It wasn't, you know, there would have been no possibility. I couldn't even let him know that I was coming, or, you know, seek his advice about anything. The other problem was one of image, I guess, that if anybody talked about Korea in the 1970s, early 1980s, the image that was on TV news periodically was one of clouds of tear gas on the streets of Seoul as masses of students battled, literally battled, against hordes of people dressed like Darth Vader. You know, there were these stormtroops, heavily shielded, heavily masked, heavily everything. You know, they were very intimidating. And I think I have an allergy to military dictatorships. I mean, I'm just not.
That seems reasonably healthy.
I'm just not comfortable with them. So I didn't want to go to Seoul. I didn't want to go to Korea. It was low on my list of priorities.
Sure.
So I was traveling around the region, exploring country by country, trying to discover something about film history in each country and trying to see interesting new work in each country. Korea was not really in my field of vision. In 1988, I met two young opposition figures from Korea, both of whom were involved in film. And they put together a small package of underground indie films from Korea made by students.
So is this one year after the fall of the dictatorship?
No. It's the height of the dictatorship. 88. The reason they were able to bring a package of films out, they smuggled the films out. They had no sanction for doing that. But the reason that they were able to do this in 88 was because 88, if you remember, was the year of the Seoul Olympics. And Chun Doo-hwan's regime, which was otherwise one of the most offensive, obnoxious regimes in the world in terms of its oppression and its censorship and its totalitarian behavior, was trying rather desperately to present a more benign face to the world as it was preparing to welcome the world to the Olympics. So suddenly certain restrictions, before that it was very, very hard for any Korean to travel internationally. It was just, you had to jump through too many hoops. I'm sure academics and business people did occasionally travel, but not as much as you might expect. And it was always hard for them. Students, young people, almost never. But these two had managed to get exit visas to go to a film festival overseas, and it was entirely because of this new climate of relaxation. Suddenly the authorities were being a bit less draconian than they usually were. And I'd met them, I saw their films. The films that they were showing were not so impressive, to be honest, but I was surprised to discover that there were such things as Korean independent films, that it existed at all. And I was interested in that sense, and I liked meeting them and talking to them. And I explained my situation, said I've never been to Korea, and I've never really been attracted to Korea because of the image and because of the government and so on. And they said, oh, you should go now, because this is a good year. You know, because of the Olympics coming up, they're being much
the window of opportunity to get
relaxed.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. You got it. So they gave me, I said, okay, I'll see if I can do that. I'm going to be in the region in a couple of months' time. I'll see about making a side trip to Korea for the first time to just look around a bit and explore. And they were kind enough to give me a list of 5 names and telephone numbers, saying, you know, these people will help you. If you get to Seoul, call these people and they will help you. So cutting the long story short, I arrive in Seoul. The hotel desk at the airport recommends a Central Seoul hotel, which is still now my regular hotel in Seoul when I visit. I check into a room there, I sit down, I pick up the phone, I call the first name and number on the list that they've given me, and I say, hello, my name is Tony Rayns, I'm visiting Korea for the first time, and boom, the phone slams down at the other end. And I now think that this, I'm sure this is because they were, whoever it was not expecting a call in English, and was intimidated and scared and probably didn't understand it anyway and was alarmed and
but what trouble is this going to get me
yes,
into?
Sure. So I move. I'm shocked, but I move on to the second name on the list. I call the second name. The same thing happens. The phone is slammed down almost immediately, and I think, oh, this is hopeless. I'm not going to.
Meet anyone.
Wasted visit.
Anything.
It's going to be hopeless. I won't meet anyone. I won't do anything. It's going to be terrible. So anyway, I try the third name on the list, and the third name speaks to me.
Do we know this name? Do I know this name?
His name is Hong Kong Bio, who is a cinematographer now. He's now a famous cinematographer. He's shot films for Bong Joon-ho and many people, many leading directors. At that time, he was a new graduate from the Korean Academy of Film Arts, the leading film school, but the only film school at that time. And he spoke rather poor English, but at least he did speak some English, and he didn't slam the phone down. And I managed to explain that I was hoping to meet young film people and see some films. And I'd be so grateful if he could give me some help. And he very kindly came over to the hotel. And it turned out that he and other recent graduates from the Academy of Film Arts, the film school, had they were finding it impossible to break into the film industry in 1988. There were no openings for their generation at all in the commercial film industry. But what was burgeoning was a new advertising industry, producing ads for TV. And these guys they were nearly all guys, could get jobs, casual jobs, working on commercials, which were paying reasonably well and enabling them to survive. In the meantime, they had set up a club for themselves. They'd rented a room above a shop, not very far from the film school itself. And they would tend to convene there in the afternoon and read the newspaper, drink coffee, maybe drink something stronger than coffee, but talk about possibilities, discuss what kind of films they should be making, what was wrong with Korean cinema, all the usual things that earnest kids discuss.
Could they use the
So Mr. Hoddy, the cinematographer who came to the hotel as he promised, took me there. He said, "Come with me," he said, and I followed him through the streets of the center of Seoul, and he led me to this upstairs room above the little shop. And I walked in, and immediately one face smiled, and I think he'd been pre-alerted by telephone, came across the room to meet me, and he spoke very, very good English and remains a close friend to this day. So I won't embarrass him by giving his name, but he's one of my best friends in Korea and has looked out for me in many ways as I've tried to look out for him. Anyway, that was the beginning of a great friendship. With a number of individuals who became, I think, friends for life, it's fair to say, but also between me and Korea, because I began to understand much more about Korea and to like Korea. I think Korea is in many ways a much more attractive country than Japan, for example, because Korean thinking is on the whole a great deal closer to a Western way of thinking. It's a cross between a Chinese influenced way of thinking and a Western way of thinking, perhaps. Don't know if it's because of the presence of the Americans in South Korea, but since the early 50s. But in any event, there's a lot of individualism in Korea, which you don't find so much in China, and you do find rather a lot in Western countries. So there's much less conformity than is the norm in Japan, for example. So it's very rare to find anyone in Japan who stands out from the crowd, whereas in Korea, it's sort of expected.
And what was the sort of first film you saw there, which made you think, hang on, there's something really interesting happening?
I'm not sure if I can say it was something that made me think it was the most interesting thing, but the friend I met in the students' club, the ex-students' club, said, "Oh, there's a feature now playing in a commercial theatre in Seoul, made by a new director. You want to go and see it?" I said, "You bet. Hold me back. Let's go." And of course, it wasn't subtitled, but he took me to see this film. And it was a film called The Age of Success. It was a satire on materialism, on consumerism, and it was written and directed by a director called Jang Sun-woo. And it was his first mainstream feature. He had made an underground feature before this, which had barely been seen, and I didn't see it till quite a bit later than that. But anyway, this one was made for a commercial company and showed in a mainstream cinema. Mm-hmm. I thought it was not great. I didn't care for the satire seemed a bit obvious to me, but I watched it as a Westerner. I'm used to seeing rather sophisticated kinds of satire of politics and consumerism and all kinds of things in my own culture and in other Western cultures. But in Korea, this was pretty new. There was nothing quite like this before. And I could respect its novelty while not being personally wildly enthusiastic about it. But it had the overriding merit of introducing me to Jang Sun-woo, who turned out to be a big figure in my life for most of the 1990s, the following decade, and about whom I made a feature-length documentary in 2001.
The Jang Sun-woo Variations.
The self-same, yes.
And so from there, we're seeing, I mean, now I think Korean cinema is probably considered one of the kind of the sort of hottest areas in the world for.
Well, to some degree.
I mean, it's moving slower maybe than you are. So in other words, Parasite, everyone's thinking about.
Yes, of course. It's true. No, it's interesting. Sight and Sound magazine, published by the BFI, the new issue, which is due out any day now. I mean, I think it may be online already, but it's the physical object will appear any minute now. Their new issue is called something to do with Korean cinema. The cover, Korean cinema is the cover feature anyway. It's on the front cover. And one of the main things in it, I mean, it's been put out to coincide with the release of a film by Park Chan-wook called Decision to Leave, which they all think is going to be a big hit. I personally don't think it's going to be a very big hit, but that's just my opinion. That's the tie-in feature anyway. It's because of the release of this film.
Yeah.
However, one of the major items in the issue is a little essay by me talking to some degree about how I discovered Korean cinema myself, what I've just been talking about, but also then a list of, I think, 30 neglected Korean films, not all from me, only a few of them are from me, but lots of writers have contributed to this, and they made the choices. It's not my choice, but short notes about 30 odd Korean films made since the political change to democracy and civilian governments, which happened in 1993, so 5 years after I first visited, and highlighting all kinds of films that were made as a consequence of that political change. It was also a revolution in the industry. I mean, the old industry collapsed virtually overnight. Censorship was greatly relaxed. Everything changed. In fact, new sources of financing suddenly appeared miraculously out of the blue, and a new kind of cinema was made. Most of the companies that had been making films under the military governments before closed up overnight. Only 2 or 3 continued into the 1990s. I mean,
it still feels like
it's a drastic change.
The Korean New Wave, or whatever you would like to call it, has been a long time coming. I mean, I remember in 1996 seeing at the London Film Festival, which you were curating, Day a Pig Fell in a Well, Green Fish, I think, was at the same, so it feels like, to me, the sort of mid to late 90s when it really started happening.
I thought so too, but that's why we did the event at the ICA you've just shown the program for.
Yeah.
I felt in the early 90s something was clearly happening. I could see that there was a new energy, a new willingness to tackle oppositional themes. There was a very strongly evident opposition to the military governments. There was the final military appointed government was headed by a man called his name, no, his surname, I think his name has gone from my head at this moment, but in any event, he was much less authoritarian than his predecessors, and realized he had to be. I mean, it was necessary by this time for the government to show a softer face, as it were, towards its people, and there were attempts made to bring crowd control under within reasonable limits, and to allow people certain freedoms, and censorship was still held pretty fast, but you could sense that things were changing. And by meeting quite a lot of people by that time, in the early 90s, I was meeting lots of filmmakers, seeing lots of work, and could feel very palpably that change was afoot. So I came back to London in, I think, 93, talked to Simon Field again. I said, listen, I think there is something happening in Korean cinema. Real changes are afoot. There's at least one old master in Kwon-taek who's doing his best work now, and there are quite a number of younger filmmakers who are coming up fast and succeeding in making films in the last couple of years, who I think deserve support and need to be noticed. So furthermore, thanks to 1993's change of government, I think the new government will be willing to subsidize this. They have an office called the Korean Motion Picture Promotion Corporation.
Promotion, goodness.
It later morphed into KOFIC, the
Yeah.
Korean Film Commission. But that was at that time, in the early 90s, this was the government film office, as it were. And it had a specific mission to promote Korean cinema.
KOFIC underwrote our Hong Sang-soo tour in
It
2010.
did, of course,
So,
yes,
yeah,
because it
it's
still has that
yeah.
mission. It's one of its objects. But
Yeah.
anyway, I by that time, of course, I was quite familiar with the hierarchy at the KMPPC, and I was able to go to them and say, listen, I think we'd like to do an event in London to support Korean cinema. Would you underwrite it? Will you help us pay for it? Because we don't, I do it at a small art house cinema called the ICA. You won't have heard of it. And they're not rich, we can, so we can only do this if you back us, if you help us, pay airfares, pay to freight the prints over, that kind of thing. And they said, yes, no problem, because they had few offers like this. This was unknown for them. So that's how we put that.
And were you surprised at that, or were you?
No, I expected it.
Yeah,
I thought they would,
okay.
because I knew them well enough by that time to know that they weren't terribly successful in attracting international interest to Korean cinema. So this was a welcome initiative.
Gosh, how things have changed, right? I'm very conscious we've got about 15 more minutes.
Okay.
And we should probably have some questions.
We
from
should.
the audience.
I
I think there's Korean filmmakers we haven't touched on, like Lee Chang-dong,
Yes, sure.
or Hong Sang-soo in many
Yes.
But perhaps we'll get some questions about those.
Well, I think what I should just say briefly is that because I was lucky enough to make my first visit in '88, because I was lucky enough to meet these two underground indie filmmakers in Europe who encouraged me to visit, I meant I was in the right place at the right time to see the movement or the wave take shape. And I met many of the key people like Park Kwang-soo, for example, who made Berlin Report and Black Republic, and before that a film called Chilsu and Mansu, which were seminal new wave films. I met Jang Sun-woo, who made, I already talked about The Age of Success, but he went on to make a film called Lovers in Umukbemi, which is a brilliant kind of social realist sexual satire on sexual roles, which is rather critical of the male role, and rather supportive of the female role. He made another film in that vein based on the Korean version of a nouveau roman called Road to the Racetrack, which doesn't have any roads or racetracks in it, and is about two students who had been growing up together and had been something of an item. But the woman plagiarizes the man's thesis, publishes it as her own, and which creates all kinds of resentments and troubles and so on. The film is a very witty exploration of this. And then he made a neo-Buddhist fable called Hwam-gyong. And then he made a raucous and extraordinarily committedly vulgar social satire called To You From Me. So to me, that made Jang Sun-woo a very singular figure. And each film radically different from the others. Always vitally interesting, always incredibly lively and provocative and fascinating. And I thought, wow, this is really something. This is somebody like Oshima was in Japan in the 60s. Somebody who is really, really pushing all the boundaries at once and trying all kinds of different things, and always from a radical perspective. So that's what got me interested and made me fascinated and made me want to push these things. And as I said, I was lucky enough to be there as this was all happening, watched it happening, got to meet many of the key people, had some involvement helping with subtitles or whatever, writing press kits. But the key thing I did, obviously, was come back to Simon Field and mediate this deal with the KMPPC to put on an event in London, which I think it went quite well. But certainly in audience terms, it went very well. We had full houses for many of these films, and all 5 filmmakers who were featured came to London, were flown into London. All of them did sit-down Q&As.
Do you want to just mention who the filmmakers were?
Well, In Contact was the veteran, the senior veteran. So we were presenting, I think, 4 In Contact films, including Mandala. Then from the new wave, we had Park Kwang-soo, Jang Sun-woo, Lee Myung-se, who is a very singular figure, rather standing apart from the new wave, but nonetheless highly innovative and very skilled and talented. And finally, a guy called Kim Ui-suk, who was at that time making satires on young middle-class couples basically about sexual mores, about the sexual attitudes, the backwardness of Korean male sexual attitudes, and the growing assertiveness of Korean female sexual attitudes, it would be fair to say. These are not sexploitation films, but they are about relationships, marriages, in which things tend to go wrong because of misunderstandings between the genders.
Perhaps this is a good time. I can see Gemma here is waiting with some
poised questions. Okay.
Gemma, we
Sorry,
can't see questions here at our end, so Gemma is going to kindly.
Okay, yes, that's
channel
good.
them
That's
through.
good. That's good.
I am, yes. I've got a couple of new questions from tonight, but also before this session, I went back and found some questions that were asked before and that you didn't have a chance to answer. So we're going to do a bit of a mix, but I'll go with one from tonight first, Tony, if that's okay. So Selena has asked, can Tony tell us about some of the women filmmakers from East Asia he has introduced to UK and or US audiences?
Well, I have to say there's nobody I've introduced to the UK who's been a big hit thus far. I've tried hard with a number of women directors, and it's been an uphill struggle, I have to say. It's not only because they're women, it's also true that it has generally become much harder in the last decade to get distributors, cinemas, festivals interested in the kind of work that I'm trying to push. So, for example, there is a prominent woman director in Japan called Nishikawa Miwa. She was something of a protege originally of Koreeda, who's of course become quite a famous director, probably the most famous director of his generation. And the two of them, she had worked briefly as his assistant, so she had enjoyed his help at some early stage in her career. She'd made 2 or 3 features on her own after that experience with him. And then she and he teamed up to found a new company when both of them became rather disenchanted with the existing production companies and the existing possibilities in Japanese mainstream cinema. And they decided they should have their own company called Bunbuku, which is to support their own work and also other people they think are deserving of their support. So Nishikawa-san she's done consistently terrific work, I think it's fair to say. I have been pushing now for at least 6 years to try and get her work seen, screened, discussed in London. She also has written novel versions of some of her stories. So her films exist in parallel with written fictions, which I think have also not been translated yet. They have into French, not into English. And I have to say it's been a worse than uphill struggle. Now that's just one example. There are quite a number of interesting filmmakers in Korea who are women. Im Sun-rae would be one of the most obvious prominent names. She's been to London. I've hosted Q&As with her in London. I've tried very hard to promote her work whenever I've been able to. And she's not a household name. Have you heard of Im Sun-rae? I mean, I doubt it. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me, and it doesn't reflect badly on you in any way. But she's been to London a number of times. She has done Q&As with audiences in London. Films have been screened. It hasn't broken through.
And she's a big star.
It's not for want of trying, is what I'm trying to say. So, I mean, I can't answer the question comprehensively because there's a long list of people. There are interesting Filipino women directors. There are quite a lot of interesting Chinese women directors. I mentioned Song Fang earlier, who, acted for Ho Xiaoxian when she was a student in Paris, but since then has directed and written 2 films and starred in them herself. So she's an actor, director. There are quite a number of other important figures in China who are making women who are making films. I can't go through the whole long list because it would just
I understand.
take far more time than we have. But take it from me, there are loads in Japan. There are many, 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 not many in the industry, but lots and lots and lots in the independent sector in Japan. Animators, fiction filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, all kinds. And all I can say is I've done my best to promote their work whenever I've had a forum to do so.
You just got it now.
But I'm an old man now and I have no power anymore. So it's, nobody takes any of this seriously from me. But there's a new generation which should be picking up this relay, but is not doing a terribly good job, in my view. But then that's just a grumpy old man speaking. But,
well, maybe
it is part of the job is to promote the work, and you do whatever you can, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work.
Well, maybe I could ask a question from a previous session that might give you an opportunity to do that a little bit again. We had a question from Sean who said, what might be at the top of your list of films that remain undeservedly inaccessible to Western audiences, whether due to lack of translation or lack of mainstream appeal?
It's a terribly difficult question. It's like when you're asked to do a 10 best list and something, and you just toss and turn all night worrying about the ones you've left off, or how constricting it is, and how it's impossible to do. Everybody who gets asked to take part in these lists suffers this in this way, and this is a little bit the same, I think. I'm going to sidestep it a little bit by referring you back to what I said earlier about Jang Sun-woo, the Korean director. And I described in brief, just thumbnails, some of his early films, four or five in a row, pointing out they were all radically different from each other, but all of them individually were very exciting and interesting and provocative. And to me, that's some kind of pinnacle of what, I'm amazed that has not been noticed. I'm not so amazed now because in 2001, Jang Sun-woo made a big budget spectacle with a lot of CGI, a kind of action adventure. But unlike other big budget action adventures with a lot of CGI, this was a Buddhist fable, which was framed as a variation on a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. Now, it's a profoundly Buddhist film, steeped in Buddhist mythology and with very clear Buddhist meanings and messages embedded in it. It was very expensive to make. It was a catastrophic flop in the Korean market and was barely sold overseas and barely seen overseas. It has since been briefly rediscovered in Vienna, with a little bit of help from me, actually, but Vienna wanted to screen it as a rediscovery, it did well. But it was so disastrous in Korea and commercially, the losses were so great, that Jang Sun-woo retired from filmmaking. So he hasn't made a film for the last 20 years since this one. He still has, I still see him occasionally. He's now living on Jeju Island in the south, off the south coast of South Korea. And he's a happy man. He is a Buddhist, or he practices Buddhism in various ways. But he lives very happily. He and his partner run a small cafe in a little village on Jeju Island, and he still writes scripts. He still publishes books. He does various things that are film related, but nobody is exactly clamoring to finance him. So I can't promote him as an active filmmaker.
Did they really think this film was going to be a big commercial?
Yes, he did, and so did the company. Yes, the company did. And there was reason. Part of the problem, I think, was that two other big budget films just before had flopped catastrophically as well, and his was lumped in with the other two. And number two, he had chosen he put the young lady. The film is called The Resurrection of the Little Match Girl. The little match girl in this story is played by a young star who had become a major figure in Korean advertising. She'd featured in some advertising campaign on TV and had become a national obsession. So everybody was trying to build on that. Jang Sun-ho was persuaded that this would be a big boost for the film's business and promotion and so on. By the time the film came out, 2 years later, she'd been forgotten. So her name meant nothing anymore. That value was lost. He cast Jin Xing, who is China's most famous transsexual, a dancer, a ballet dancer and choreographer. He invited her of Korean roots herself. She's Chinese Korean. Jin Xing was invited to come and play the kind of Lara Croft figure in the story, action heroine on a motorcycle.
Sounds like a winner.
She's terrific, absolutely fabulous.
Yeah.
But she somehow or other, it didn't take off in Korea. Her name didn't register with the Korean viewers, and the film didn't anyway benefit from that brilliant piece of casting, a very daring piece of casting. So it didn't work. I mean, but they did think it was going to be a big hit, yes.
Yeah.
I was going to say that we didn't have time for any more questions, but actually my next question was from Josh, who asked that you were a major booster of Jang Sun-won, who unfortunately has rather dropped off the radar over the last 2 decades. What's he like and what is he up to now? So you've just answered that question.
Jang Sun-ho. Okay, yes.
Sorry. So you did answer another question, Tony, without realizing it. We've managed to do 3 rather than just 2, so thank you. But we are
a second documentary about him called Jang Sun-ho in November, which is about his time in Jeju Island and what he does and how he lives, and discussing whether he's ever going to resume his career and this kind of thing. It's on a Blu-ray in Korea, but it's sadly not been released anywhere in any Western country. But it's I still have hopes that one day he will come back and make another film.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time now. Thank you both so much for this evening. It's been incredibly interesting and valuable, just like the previous 2 installments. So if anyone here has missed those, I would urge you to go back and watch them on the ICO YouTube channel. Thank you to everyone for joining us live this evening, and we hope that you'll join us again for Gemma Desai's event, which, as I said before, we'll be releasing more details about shortly. Yes, so thank you so much again, Simon, for masterfully guiding the conversation, and Tony for once again sharing so much about your experiences and your stories with us. Thank you.
Great pleasure. Thank you. See you in part 4.